We're usually taught that having a deep, profound fear of the state is, well, it's basically paranoia. But what if it isn't? The source material we're digging into today introduces this idea called statophobia, and it makes the case that this fear might just be the sanest possible response to the world we live in. So let's just dive right in. This single question, this is really at the heart of everything. It forces you to rethink some of your most basic assumptions about trust, about authority. Are the old rules still valid in the world we live in today? Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll frame this whole question of sanity. Then we're going to redefine what distrust even means in this context. After that, we'll pull a really surprising lesson from history, see how it all plays out today in the world of cryptography, and finally, we'll look at what this paranoid sanity actually looks like in practice. So first up, let's just challenge the default setting. The source material is asking us, is that deep-seated fear of the state really a phobia in the clinical sense? Like a sickness that needs to be treated? Or is it something else entirely? Right, so if it's not a flaw, then what is it? Well, this is where the source proposes a pretty radical new framework. What if this deep distrust isn't a pathology at all, but is actually a highly evolved defense mechanism? Okay, so this is the core distinction the source is making. On one hand, you've got your classic clinical phobia, an irrational, out-of-proportion fear. But on the other hand, the source puts forward this idea of systematic distrust, and that's framed as a calculated, logical response to an entity that, let's be honest, holds a monopoly on force. The argument is that these two things are fundamentally different. This brings us to this really fascinating term, adaptive neuroticism. The whole idea here is that in a hostile environment, say a pervasive surveillance state, traits that we normally think of as negative, like anxiety and suspicion, can actually flip and become advantageous. They become tools that protect you. And to make this really hit home, the source uses this powerful analogy of a prey animal. Think about it. A deer's constant, twitchy vigilance isn't a disease. It's literally what keeps it alive. The argument, then, is that if you see the modern state as the predator, that same level of vigilance is just a rational survival mechanism. Now, you're probably thinking this is all a very modern internet age kind of idea, right? But the source material argues that it has these really deep historical roots, and it points to a group you probably wouldn't expect, the Luddites. And this is where we get this really interesting reinterpretation of the Luddites. We tend to just write them off as being anti-technology, but the source argues that their fight, back in the early 1800s, wasn't against the machines themselves. It was about fighting a new system of control that was literally taking away their autonomy. And that right there is the key distinction. These were skilled artisans, craftsmen. They saw their entire way of life, their independence, being completely steamrolled by a factory system where they were no longer masters of their craft. They were basically becoming servants to a machine and its owner. So they resisted the specific technology that was enslaving them. And boom, that brings the whole historical parallel right into our world today. A modern digital Luddite, according to this view, isn't some guy who hates his smartphone. It's someone who actively rejects specific technologies that they see as tools for control, things like centralized social media platforms or even something like central bank digital currencies, which could give a government a direct window into every single thing you buy. Okay, so where does this whole digital Luddite impulse actually pop up today? The source points to one area in particular, and it provocatively calls it the cult of cryptography. Now, the guiding principle for this whole community is something called technological autarky, and this is a really fascinating concept. Basically, the goal is to use technology to become independent from the system, to use tech to carve out your own little pocket of digital self-sufficiency, where the rules of the mainstream world just don't apply. And this worldview, it's kind of broken down into core beliefs, which the source calls dogmas, and the practical actions or rituals that they inspire. So you take a dogma like don't trust, verify. What's the ritual? It's using tools like PGP encryption so you know for a fact no third party can read your messages. Or the dogma code is law. That leads to the ritual of preferring open source software where anyone can check the code for backdoors. See? It's all about using technology to remove the need to trust big institutions. Okay, so this mind map from the source, it does a great job of showing how all these ideas really connect into this one coherent worldview. You can literally trace a line from that core fear of the state, through the Luddite principle of resisting tech that controls you, right down to the modern-day choice to run your own Bitcoin node instead of trusting a bank. It maps the philosophy directly onto the action. It's a whole self-contained ideology. All right, so we've talked about the philosophy, we've looked at the history, but what does this actually look like day to day? how does this idea of paranoid sanity actually show up in things people do? Well, the source points to a bunch of everyday things you might even do yourself. Taping over your laptop webcam, making a point to use physical cash, refusing to use your face or fingerprint to unlock your phone. Shoot, even just taking the time to actually read the terms of service. Now, a lot of people might just dismiss this stuff as being paranoid, right? But in this framework, these are seen as conscious acts of digital hygiene, just practical steps to protect your privacy from the digital panopticon. And this is the ultimate reframing of the whole idea. The source argues that these aren't the irrational tics of a paranoid mind. No, they're actually the calculated, rational actions of someone who sees the digital world for what it is, kind of hostile, and is just taking logical steps to protect themselves. It's presented as the definition of sanity, not madness. And that brings us to the final, really provocative thought from the source, which just flips the entire script on its head. The argument is that maybe the true insanity isn't the fear of these systems. Maybe the true insanity is the blind, unquestioning trust that so many of us place in them every single day. And it really makes you wonder, in a world of total surveillance and control, who are the truly crazy ones here?